"You're trespassing, and I'm calling the police." Those words hit me like a thunderbolt. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Me, trespassing, on my own property. My heart started racing as I glanced around, hoping someone would explain this madness. The HOA president was standing at the edge of my driveway, finger pointed, eyes blazing with fury. She was clearly ready to escalate the situation immediately. It all began as a simple, ordinary day. I had gone outside to check some maintenance work near my property line, something I had done countless times before without incident. But recently, our HOA had decided to enforce a bunch of new, confusing, rules about common areas and property boundaries. They claimed any resident walking on certain sections of the property without explicit approval was committing an offense. It sounded absurd, but apparently, they were dead serious. As I tried to reason with her, explaining that I was on my own land, her face turned redder with every word. She waved her phone threateningly, insisting she would call the cops right then and there. I could feel the tension building, not just from her but from neighbors peeking from behind curtains, clearly anxious about what might happen next. Her behavior was so over the top that I couldn't help but think how petty this had become. A simple patch of grass, a driveway, and suddenly the HOA was acting like law enforcement. Little did they know, I wasn't just any resident. They were about to find out I had the ultimate legal authority. But at that moment, all I could do was stand there, calmly smiling, hiding the mix of frustration and amusement building inside me. It was a tense standoff that could have gone very differently if I hadn't known exactly what my rights were, and how powerless an HOA really is against someone who knows the law. The logic, or more accurately, the lack of logic, behind this HOA's rules was unbelievable. Their so-called regulations were buried in a handbook thicker than most novels, filled with vague phrases like, common areas are off limits unless approved, or, residents must adhere to all board decisions without question. It was the kind of language designed to confuse and intimidate anyone who dared question it. Yet here I was, walking across a patch of grass I had owned for over a decade, and suddenly I was a criminal in their eyes. I could almost see them imagining me as some sort of rogue villain, trampling their precious rules and threatening the order they so desperately wanted to control. The irony, they were the ones breaking common sense rules of fairness and decency. HOAs are notorious for this kind of overreach. They hide behind legal jargon and convoluted bylaws, hoping residents won't question their authority. One small misstep, and suddenly you're facing fines, warnings, or even threats of court action. I've seen neighbors bend over backward just to avoid conflict, paying ridiculous fees or obeying nonsensical demands, afraid to speak up. But for me, this was different. I wasn't about to let a group of paper pushers intimidate me on my own property. I knew that HOAs derive power from fear and compliance. The moment you realize their threats are mostly bluff, the whole structure begins to crumble. And in that tense, ridiculous moment on my driveway, I made a mental decision. I wasn't going to play by their twisted rules. I would stand my ground, not with anger, but with knowledge and authority. Little did they know, I wasn't just any resident. They were about to learn that I had the ultimate power to challenge everything they were trying to enforce. The balance of power was about to shift, and it was going to be spectacular. Just when the tension reached its peak, I decided it was time to drop the bombshell. The HOA president was practically shaking, phone in hand, ready to call the cops, thinking she had all the power. She didn't realize that the person standing in front of her wasn't just another resident. This wasn't going to be an ordinary confrontation. "I don't need a lawyer," I said, keeping my voice calm but firm. "Because I am the judge who can dissolve this HOA." Her eyes widened, and the color drained from her face. For a moment, she looked like someone had just pulled the rug out from under her. The board members who had gathered nearby froze, unsure of how to respond. Suddenly, the air shifted. The person who had been threatening me with fines and arrests was confronted with a truth they hadn't anticipated. I had the ultimate authority over their organization. I explained calmly, for the benefit of everyone watching, that HOAs operate under state law. If an association abuses its power, fails to comply with regulations, or harasses residents, a judge has the legal authority to intervene, and in extreme cases, dissolve the HOA entirely. The mere knowledge of this power caused an immediate change in their demeanor. Their bluster, their threats, all evaporated into stunned silence. It was a surreal moment. The bullies had been silenced not by anger, not by confrontation, but by knowledge and authority. I watched as they tried to collect themselves, muttering under their breath, clearly realizing that their control over residents like me was not as absolute as they had thought. That revelation alone changed everything. The HOA, which had thrived on fear and intimidation, suddenly had no power over me. And I knew, in that moment, that the rest of this battle would be less about confrontation and more about watching justice unfold. After the big reveal, I could almost hear the wheels turning in their heads. The HOA had spent weeks preparing to intimidate me, sending letters, posting rules on their bulletin boards, and trying to create the illusion of control. But suddenly, all of that crumbled like a house of cards. Their threats, their emails, their so-called legal power, it was meaningless now that they realized who they were dealing with. Over the next few days, I watched them squirm. They tried everything. Emails filled with legal jargon landed in my inbox, each one more desperate than the last. They scheduled secret meetings, hoping to discuss me behind closed doors, thinking if they whispered loud enough, they could regain authority. I even received passive-aggressive notices from the board, hinting at fines for future violations. I stayed calm. Every message, every threat, every attempt to intimidate me became a piece of evidence. I documented it all meticulously, making sure nothing could be overlooked. And as I did, neighbors who had previously been silent started coming forward. They shared stories of ridiculous fines, arbitrary rules, and petty harassment, confirming what I had suspected all along. This HOA thrived on fear, not fairness. The irony was beautiful. The very people who thought they were untouchable were now exposed, vulnerable, and powerless. I didn't even need to take drastic action. The knowledge that I could dissolve the HOA was enough to make them retreat. Within a week, their president sent a formal apology and promised to review their policies, clearly realizing that any further attempts at intimidation would be their undoing. Watching them struggle to regain composure was oddly satisfying. The message was clear. The HOA had overstepped, and the balance of power had shifted. For the first time, the residents could breathe easy, knowing that fairness and authority were no longer just empty words, they were enforceable. In the aftermath of the confrontation, I had time to reflect on what had just happened. This wasn't just a personal victory, it was a wake-up call for the entire neighborhood. The HOA, which had operated with arrogance and a sense of untouchable authority, had finally been reminded that they were accountable under the law. And more importantly, residents like me weren't powerless. They had rights, knowledge, and the ability to defend themselves. The experience taught me 3 critical lessons that I believe every resident should know. First, knowledge is power. The HOA thought they could scare me into compliance with threats of fines or even arrest, but understanding the law gave me the upper hand. Without that knowledge, I could have been caught in their trap like so many others. Second, documentation matters. Every email, every text, every incident I recorded became evidence that strengthened my position. In disputes like this, clear records are your best weapon. And third, standing up for your rights matters. Many neighbors are afraid of HOAs because they worry about retaliation, but fear only gives bullies more power. Courage, even in small doses, changes the game. Walking freely across my property, feeling the grass under my feet without worry, was a moment of pure satisfaction. The HOA's threats had failed, and justice had prevailed, not through anger, but through authority, preparation, and patience. Neighbors began smiling again, quietly grateful that someone had taken a stand, reminding them that fairness still exists. In the end, this wasn't just about a patch of land or a driveway, it was about accountability. HOAs can't act like kingdoms, making rules without oversight or consequence. And as for me, trespassing was never an issue. I was standing on what was rightfully mine, fully aware that when knowledge meets authority, even the most overbearing one must step back. Victory wasn't just personal, it was a lesson in courage, justice, and the power of knowing your rights.